好，各位老师、各位同学、王主任还有大使，大家好。那今天晚上是一个非常特别的一个演讲活动啊。那么这也是我们通识人物泰戈尔系列演讲的第4场，最后一场也是最精彩的一场。那么今天非常的荣幸可以邀请到印度大使Mr. 大使先生来参加我们的活动，并且担任主要的演讲者。那么在今天的这个活动正式的演讲活动开始之前，那么我们也希望能够透过通识中心所主办的通识人物系列演讲的这样子的一个活动的场合，能够让各位同学多了解一些印度的文化哈。所以呢，我们一个很荣幸的就邀请到孟加拉民谣走唱团，然后待会呢会由这个2位一个是方小姐，还有一位是Roger 先生那么由他们来为我们表演泰戈尔的这个诗歌。那么大家知道泰戈尔其实他是这个孟加拉人那么他过去很多的诗文都是用孟加拉文所写所以呢待会经由这个走唱团来吟唱，我相信会让大家对于印度的这样的一个歌谣文化，还有他们的这个文学文化会有一些不同的这个想法那么接下来呢，我们就以热烈的掌声来欢迎今天的孟加拉走唱团来为我们带来精彩的表演。
大家好
，Hello，
我们是孟加拉民谣走唱团，我是团长，我叫方小倩。那我就是我们从2013
2012 actually.
No 30.
Oh yeah, we started working on 20.
对，我们从2013年开始就是有这样子的合作，然后就是带给台湾一些印度的，就是孟加拉地区，主要是孟加拉地区的一些民谣。那当然他是那边的人哈，然后就是我就是帮他伴奏。那我自己也是一个印度古典舞蹈的舞者这样。那但是今天就不琢磨在这边。好，他非常的害羞，今天有点不敢讲话。Okay, you should start now.
And the thing is, well, I think she already explained a bit about us. And most of our work, we usually focus on folk music. We predominantly a folk song group. But also, time to time, we have tried to share the songs of Rabindranath Tagore. And mostly we share the songs of Tagore which is inspired or influenced by the folk music, to be honest. So and actually so today in our presentation also many of the songs of Tagore which are influenced by folk music, but also there are some other different types. And so without further ado, I think we can start. So here is that we have the Ravindra Sangeet today, that is the songs of Tagore, and it is said that he wrote more than 2,300 songs in his lifetime. I mean, this is unimaginable how many creations he had or he still has. I mean, we are only talking about songs, by the way. If I consider about the poems, dramas, novels, short stories, I mean, I would say he's the one who defined how to write short stories. I would say that. So it is beyond imagination exactly what he was and what he is still now. He is still relevant. So today we will have a quick look at his songs. And also before we start, I would just like to say one thing, that we call him Bishwa Kobi. Kobi means poet and Bishwa means the world. He is the poet of the world, and in a true sense, he was and he still is, because he's the first one, in my opinion, who connected a bridge between the East and the West. So here we start our first song. This one is called Ami Kaan Pe Te Roi. I'm listening, I listen to the sound. শুনি বারে 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 কান পেতে ভ্রমর শেখা হয় বিভাগী নিভৃত নীল পদ্ম লাগি রে ভ্রমর শেখা হয় বিভাগী নিভৃত নীল পদ্ম লাগি রে কোন রাতের পাখি গায়ে কাকি সঙ্গী বিহীন অন্ধকারে বারে বারে কান পেতে রই কে সে মোর কে বা জানে কিছু তার দেখি আভা কিছু পাই অনুমানে কিছু তার বুঝি না বা কে সে মোর কে বা জানে কিছু তার দেখি আভা কিছু পাই অনুমানে কিছু তার বুঝি না বা মাঝে মাঝে তার বারতা আমার ভাষায় পায় কি কথা রে ও সে আমায় জানি পাঠায় বাণী গানের কানে লুকিয়ে তারে বারে বারে কান পেতে রই আমি কান পেতে রই ও আমার আপন হৃদয় কখন দ্বারে বারে বারে কান পেতে রই থ্যাংক ইউ And before we go to the next song, actually, let me just also introduce a little bit about how we do our work. I mean, for example, in this slide, you can see that we have the Mandarin translation of the lyrics. Basically, when we first started working on the folk songs or also the songs of Rabindranath Tagore, we decided that we want to introduce the meaning at least to our to our Taiwanese friends, so they can understand exactly, maybe not the accurate way, but at least they can get the gist what a poet is trying to say. So this is what we do. We try to translate as much as we can. She's the main translator right now, but also we have worked with another elder sister of ours. She's a terrific tabla player, but also she's an ethnomusicologist, and she also helped us for this purpose. So let's go back to our next song. Next song is called Bhenge Mor Ghorer Chabi. This one is a quite popular song in our place, both West Bengal and Bangladesh, and it is very much inspired from a baul song. Okay. And baul is one of the most popular folk tradition in India or in Bengal, if I call it. If we start talking about that, then it will cover the entire 30 minutes, or even it will talk longer. So let's not talk about this right now. Let's focus on this one. You can see the translation here. ভেঙে মোর ঘরের চাবি নিয়ে যাবি কে আমারে ভেঙে মোর ঘরের চাবি নিয়ে যাবি কে আমারে ও বন্ধু আমার না পেয়ে তো একা একা দিন যে আমার কাটে না রে ভেঙে মোর ঘরের চাবি নিয়ে যাবি কে আমারে ভেঙে মোর ঘরের চাবি নিয়ে যাবি কে আমারে বুঝি গো রাত পোহালো বুঝি ওই রবির আলো আভাসে দেখা দিল গগন পারে সম্মুখে ওই হেরি পথ তোমার কি রথ পৌঁছবে না মোর দুবারে ভেঙে মোর ঘরের চাবি নিয়ে যাবি কে আমারে ভেঙে মোর ঘরের চাবি নিয়ে যাবি কে আমারে আকাশের যত তারা চেরয় নিমেষ হারা চেরয় রাত প্রভাতের পথের ধারে আকাশের যত তারা চেরয় নিমেষ হারা বসে রয় রাত প্রভাতের পথের ধারে তোমারই দেখা পেলে সকল পেলে ডুববে আলোক পারাবারে ভেঙে মোর ঘরের চাবি নিয়ে যাবি কে আমারে ভেঙে মোর ঘরের চাবি নিয়ে যাবি কে আমারে প্রভাতের পথিক সবে এলো কি কলরবে গেল কি গান গে ওই সারে সারে বুঝিবা ফুল ফুটেছে সুর উঠেছে অরুণ বীণার তারে তারে ভেঙে মোর ঘরের চাবি নিয়ে যাবি কে আমারে ভেঙে মোর ঘরের চাবি নিয়ে যাবি কে আমারে থ্যাংক ইউ Now the next song is actually it's about the nature, and also Tagore songs can be divided into several segments, or we call it porjai. So there are devotional songs, there are patriotic songs, there are songs about love. Also there are songs about the nature. So this song is also about the nature, and this song talks about a river, like how a river flows. So this one is called Ogo Nodi Apon Bege Pagul Para. And one thing, we will sing this song with this one. I think you know what it is. It's Taiwan Yuechim. So when we started working, so this is also another thing we did. We started working with Taiwan Yuechim because we didn't have any instrument here. So this is the one thing we had. So here we go. ওগো নদী আপন বেগে পাগল পারা নিস্তব্ধ চাপার তরু গন্ধ ভরে তন্দ্রাহারা নদী আপন বেগে পাগল পারা নিস্তব্ধ চাপার তরু গন্ধ ভরে তন্দ্রাহারা নদী আপন বেগে পাগল পারা আমি সদা চল থাকি গভীর চলা গোপন রাখি আমি সদা চল থাকি গভীর চলা গোপন রাখি আমার চলা নবীন পাতায় আমার চলা ফুলের ধারা ওগো নদী আপন বেগে পাগল পারা আমি স্তব্ধ চাপার তরু গন্ধ ভরে তন্দ্রাহারা নদী আপন বেগে পাগল পারা ওগো নদী চলার বেগে পাগল পারা পথে পথে বাহির হয়ে আপন হারা ওগো নদী চলার বেগে পাগল পারা পথে পথে বাহির হয়ে আপন হারা আমার চলা যায় না বলা আলোর পানে প্রাণের চলা আমার চলা যায় না বলা আলোর পানে প্রাণের চলা আকাশ বোঝে আনন্দ তার বোঝে নিশার নীরব তারা ওগো নদী আপন বেগে পাগল পারা আমি স্তব্ধ চাপার তরু গন্ধ ভরে তন্দ্রাহারা নদী আপন বেগে পাগল পারা Thank you. And next one is a very special song. Why I'm calling it special? Because there are, as I told you, that Tagore has many songs which is inspired from the folk music. This one is a one big example, and actually this one is inspired from a particular type of song which is called sharigan. Sharigan actually it is, you can say that this is songs of the of the boatmen. Okay, and this song is called Ebar Tor Mora Gange Ban Esheche. And now, interesting thing is, this song is also counted as a patriotic song also. Okay, so here we go. We have the translation here, so without further ado. এবার তোর মরা গাঙে বান এসেছে জয় মা বলে ভাষা তোরি এবার তোর মরা গাঙে বান এসেছে জয় মা বলে ভাষা তোরি ওরে রে ওরে মাঝি কোথায় মাঝি প্রাণপণে ভাই ডাক দে আজি তোরা সবাই মিলে বৈঠানে রে সবাই মিলে বৈঠানে রে খুলে ফেল সব দরাদরি এবার তোর মরা গাঙে বান এসেছে জয় মা বলে ভাষা তোরি দিনে দিনে বাড়লো দেনা ও ভাই করলি নে কেউ বেচা কেনা হাতে নাই রে করা কুড়ি দিনে দিনে বাড়লো দেনা ও ভাই করলি নে কেউ বেচা কেনা হাতে নাই রে করা কুড়ি ঘাটে বাধা দিন গেল রে মুখ দেখাবি কেমন করে ওরে দে খুলে দে পাল তুলে দে দে খুলে দে পাল তুলে দে যা হয় হবে বাঁচি মরি এবার তোর মরা গাঙে বান এসেছে জয় মা বলে ভাষা তোরি এবার তোর মরা গাঙে বান এসেছে জয় মা বলে ভাষা তোরি Thank you. And okay, next one also we have a patriotic song. It's called O Amar Deshir Mati. So before she finished her settings, Let me just introduce a little bit. Most of the patriotic songs are written during the time of the Bongo Bongo Andolan, or we can call it the Bengal partition movement. If you search on Google, you can find the details of it. So I will not go to the details because it will take a little bit longer. So let's just talk about this song. So you see, in this song, poet has imagined this song as the poet has imagined our nation as a mother. So poet is saying like, mother, you have given us so much, but I'm afraid I may not be able to do much for you. So we have the translations here. Please have a look. দেশের মাটি তোমার পরে একাই মাথা ও আমার দেশের মাটি তোমার পরে একাই মাথা তোমাতে বিশ্বময়ীর তোমাতে বিশ্বমায়ের আঁচল পাতা ও আমার দেশের মাটি তোমার পরে একাই মাথা ও আমার দেশের মাটি তোমার পরে একাই মাথা তুমি মিশেছ মোর দেহে সনে তুমি মিলেছ মোর প্রাণে মনে মিশেছ মোর দেহের সনে তুমি মিলেছ মোর প্রাণে মনে তোমার ওই শ্যামল বরণ কোমল মূর্তি মর্মে গাথা ও আমার দেশের মাটি তোমার পরে ঠেকাই মাথা ও আমার দেশের মাটি তোমার পরে ঠেকাই মাথা ও গো মা তোমার কোলে জনম আমার মরণ তোমার বুকে ও মা তোমার কোলে জনম আমার মরণ তোমার বুকে তোমার পরে খেলা আমার দুঃখে সুখে তুমি অন্য মুখে তুলে দিলে তুমি শীতল জলে জুড়াইলে অন্য মুখে তুলে দিলে তুমি শীতল জলে জুড়াইলে তুমি যে সকল সহা সকল বহা মাতার মাতা ও আমার দেশের মাটি তোমার পরে ঠেকাই মাথা ও আমার দেশের মাটি তোমার পরে ঠেকাই মাথা অনেক তোমার খেয়েছি গো অনেক নিয়েছি মা ও মা অনেক তোমার খেয়েছি গো অনেক নিয়েছি মা, তবু জানি নে যে কি বা তোমায় দিয়েছি মা। আমার জনম গেল বৃথা কাজে, আমি কাটানো দিন ঘরের মাঝে, জনম গেল বৃথা কাজে, আমি কাটানো দিন ঘরের মাঝে, তুমি বৃথা আমায় শক্তি দিলে শক্তিদাতা। ও আমার দেশের মাটি, তোমার পরে ঠেকাই মাথা। ও আমার দেশের মাটি, তোমার পরে ঠেকাই মাথা। Thank you. And before we sing our last song, I want to mention one thing I have noticed, and perhaps you might notice too. Though this is a patriotic song, and Tagore wrote this. I mean, Rabindranath Tagore wrote this for his motherland, that is Bengal, or you can call it India, whatever. But actually, this is applicable for anyone who wants to dedicate this song to his or her own motherland. So let's say you want to dedicate this song to Taiwan, you might do that. Just look at the lyrics, so you can relate to it. So perhaps there is another reason it's justified that why he is called Vishwakobi, or the poet of the world. So we will end with one last song here, and it's called Amar Praner Manush. Now, as I told you that, many of our songs are inspired from the baul songs or the folk songs, and this song is perhaps the best example that how Tagore adopted or inspired, by the baul philosophy, because he came from a very sophisticated background. His creations are beautiful, but time to time he broke the mold by adopting this philosophy, by creating something so simple but so beautiful, so profound, and also, which is highly philosophical also. So this song is called Amar Praner Manush Ache Prane, means like the person I love most is inside my heart. Here we have the translation, so you can have a look. So here we go. আমার প্রাণের মানুষ আছে প্রাণে, তাই হেরি তাই সকলখানে। আমার প্রাণের মানুষ আছে প্রাণে, তাই হেরি তাই সকলখানে। আছে সে নয়ন তারায়, আছে সে নয়ন তারায়, আলোক ধারায় তাই না হারায়। ওগো তাই দেখি তাই যেথায় সেথায় তাকাই আমি যেদিক পানে। আমার প্রাণের মানুষ আছে প্রাণে, তাই হেরি তাই সকলখানে। আমার প্রাণের মানুষ আছে প্রাণে, তাই হেরি তাই সকলখানে। আমি তার মুখের কথা শুনব বলে গেলাম কোথা, আমি তার মুখের কথা শুনবো বলে গেলাম কোথা শোনা হলো না হলো না আজ ফিরে এসে নিজের দেশে ফিরে এসে নিজের দেশে এই যে শুনি শুনি তাহার বাণী আপন গানে তাহার বাণী আপন গানে প্রাণের মানুষ আছে প্রাণে তাই হেরি তাই সকলখানে আমার প্রাণের মানুষ আছে প্রাণে তাই হেরি তাই সকলখানে কে তোরা খুঁজিস তারে কাঙাল বেশে দারে দারে কে তোরা খুঁজিস তারে কাঙাল বেশে দারে দারে দেখা মেলে না মেলে না তোরা আয় রে ধে দেখ রেছে আয় রে ধে দেখ রেছে আমার বুকে ওরে দেখ রে আমার দুই নয়নে দেখ রে আমার দুই নয়নে প্রাণের মানুষ আছে প্রাণে তাই হেরি তাই সকলখানে আমার প্রাণের মানুষ আছে প্রাণে তাই হেরি তাই সকলখানে আমার প্রাণের মানুষ আছে প্রাণে তাই হেরি তাই সকলখানে Thank you.
我想大家刚刚听的一定如痴如醉，余音绕梁啊。因为时间的关系，否则我真的很想喊 uncle， 是不是可以再多唱一首歌？但是呢，待会我们因为还有很精彩的演讲活动，所以就没有办法再请小倩小姐还有这个 Roger 先生再为我们多唱一首歌。不过我们在这边是不是还是再以热烈的掌声，谢谢他们今天带来这么精彩的节目，这么棒的这个歌曲的表演，而且整个的诗词的翻译都非常的有意境哦，真的是觉得非常的开心。好，那接下来呢，我就要将这个主持棒交给我们清华大学印度中心的主任，同时也是动机系的教授王伟忠王老师，然后由他来帮我们介绍今天我们的贵宾。
谢谢翁主任。OK， President Chen and Ambassador Gourangalal Das. This is my first time to pronounce your first name. It's not easy to pronounce correctly. Okay. In fact, this is not easy to introduce the Ambassador Das because he has a lot of experience. We never know. And during the dinner, I asked him a very stupid question because as far as I know, it's very difficult to pass the examination to get into IIT. Everybody knows IIT in Taiwan. But I know even more difficult to become a foreign service people in India. But I don't know how difficult it is. So I asked him the difficult question, a very stupid question. And he told me the year he took the exam to become a foreign service man, do you know how many people attended the exam? How many? 1 million. 1 million. But then at the end, how many people passed the exam? Do you know the lady? How many? Only 9. So it's 9 out of 1 million to become the foreign service people. So how difficult it is. So he must be a very smart people. Otherwise, he wouldn't be here as ambassador in Taiwan. And he became the foreign serviceman for India very early. It started in 1999. Very soon, he was sent to China in 2001 and stayed there for 3 years. Came back to India and again to Beijing again for another 3 years and came back to India. Then he was the director for the former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh as the director for the Prime Minister office. In fact, he was in charge of the China affairs by that time. And in 2017, when Prime Minister Modi visited the United States, he was the key man because by that time he was in the United States. He was the key man to make the all travel arrangement for Modi. You know how important he is not only for China, but also for American affairs, for India. I think it's not easy. So if you want to understand Indo-Pacific strategy of US, you can ask him. Also, if you want to understand one belt, one road or policy of China, you ask him. Also, you can ask him about the quadrilateral security dialogue. Quad, we call Quad now, because it's a security dialogue among Australia, Japan, India, and which else? Japan, India, United States. 4 countries. And he was a key man to make this happen when he was on a position in the Ministry of External Affairs. So tonight we are so honored to have him to be our speaker. And you may wonder why he will use the English. Because he was in Beijing for 6 years. I asked him, where did you learn your Mandarin? He said, Beijing. 6 years. Even 6 years for me, I may not be able to speak any Hindi or Tamil. But he learned Mandarin Chinese so well, he can use Chinese to give a full lecture without any difficulties. But then, when I read his CV, I was not surprised at all. Because when he went to the United States, he went to the Middlebury School for International Studies to receive the second master degree. His first master degree is in economics from School of India Economics. But then the second master is for Chinese translation and interpretation. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Not only for translation, but also for interpretation. That's why his Chinese is so good. He can use Mandarin Chinese to deliver a speech without any difficulties. So tonight, don't miss your chance to ask him questions, difficult questions, even in Chinese. Don't worry about English. You can ask questions in Chinese. He will give you answer very, very, satisfactorily. So, without any ado, please, Ms. Ambassador, it's your floor.
Thank you, Professor Wang, and all the distinguished professors, students. I think you have put me in a very difficult position with those introduction of yours. I don't deserve any of that. I think I was purely lucky to get into the Indian Foreign Service, just as I am lucky to be here in Taiwan, and especially lucky to be here in your company at the Tsinghua University today. Glad to see so many people turning up today to listen about the great poet of India and the great poet of world, Rabindranath Tagore, about whom I am no authority. So he has told you in his own typical exaggerated way of what I am good at, but certainly I am no scholar of Tagore. So I was a little surprised to see this invitation coming my way and took it with a lot of trepidation. but I think I used it as an excuse to come back again to the Tsinghua University, which I am always happy to do. So, and thank you for arranging such a wonderful event. I know that you have had a series of lectures on Tagore and also have invited such outstanding performers of Tagore's music and brought them before this young audience. I think it's useful certainly to have the young generation connect back with the past, because that is also something that Tagore had worked throughout his life, to look at the current in the context of the past and to see what we can learn from the past and to build a better future. So he was a poet, but he was also a prophet. He had wonderful thoughts which are expressed in some of the poems or the songs that you have already heard today. But he also felt that it was his duty as a poet, as somebody who was recognized as a poet, to use his authority, to use his prestige, to do something for the society. And that is what made him a prophet. So his journey from a poet to the prophet happened at a very interesting time. And this is what I am going to talk about in the subject that has been given to me about Tagore's worldview. So before speaking about Tagore's worldview, I think it will be useful to just spend a minute talking about Tagore's world, the world that he lived in. So his was a very hierarchical world order. The world that currently we are living today is the post-Second World War world order, which was created in a more balanced, in a more sovereignty-based world. And this is a world that we are familiar with. But let's go back to the world that Tagore had lived in, which was very, very hierarchical. If you had to establish your power and authority, you had to subjugate somebody else. So this was a hierarchical world order which came about after the Western order, the Westphalian order clashed with the traditional orders of society in Asia. You had the feudal systems in some places. You had the Tianxia or the mandate of heaven in other places. All of this came into conflict with the new European world order which were coming here. And this is what was still happening when Tagore was alive. So wars were very, very frequent and also accepted way of life, because you had to just establish yourself in the hierarchical world, and the war was the only instrument that you could do it, or not the only, but mainly a main instrument through which you could do that. So during Tagore's life, he lived through the First World War and also saw some parts of the Second World War. He died in 1941, before the Second World War got over. This was also a time when the idea of nationalism, which started in Europe in the 19th century, gradually percolated to our part of the world, which is Asia, and it began to catch up in different parts of Asia. There was a parallel drive along with nationalism about how to modernize our traditional societies. The modernity also came, the notion of modernity came to us with the Europeans. And all the traditional societies started introspecting, asking themselves as to how they could modernize while at the same time preserving their old order as much as possible. So it was at sometimes felt that there was no possibility to modernize unless we also become westernized. So this is also something that agitated the minds of top philosophers, scholars at that time. And in India, when Tagore was living, the biggest phenomenon, of course, was the struggle for India's independence. As you would know, India had been a colony of the British since the 18th century, mid-18th century onwards. In fact, Bengal, where Tagore is from, was the first place that came under the control of the British, and gradually they moved forward from there to other parts of India. So this was the time when the freedom struggle in India was taking shape, and along with that, of course, the idea of how do we create a nation of India was also at the forefront of everybody's thought. So Tagore contributed to this thinking with his unique insights. So essentially I could say that the questions that shaped Tagore's worldview were also the key questions that were facing India and Asia at large, about what kind of nationhood best served us in India, in Asia, and how should our Indian nation or the other traditional Asian societies conduct and interact with the rest of the world. So, of course, these were all very, very profound topics, and Tagore was one of the many thinkers who contributed his ideas to these debates. But of course, this was not something that could be decided by one person, no matter how influential he might be. So obviously there were differences between Tagore and the other founders of the Indian nation today. And this is what we may come later in some of my presentation. So a little bit about Tagore. I am sure you have already heard enough about Tagore in the past, but he was a Renaissance man. He put his finger at everything, and in every field of his endeavor, he created excellence. So he was a school dropout. He was not fortunate to come to an university like all of you. But he had started his creative work even while he was at school, and he had written lots of poetry, fiction, plays, songs like Rabindra Sangeet, which is a genre in itself. At the age of 70, he took up painting, and he became a very good painter whose work is still appreciated throughout the world. But also he contributed, as I said, to the political philosophy, and he wrote extensively on education, on religion, on philosophy, on nationalism. He was an educationist. Even though he dropped out of school, he went on to create a model school in India, which emphasized learning in harmony with nature. And he also created this university called Biswa Bharati, which is, if you translate, it's like the world in India. So that's his contribution to education. So essentially, as a Renaissance man would be, he was very much at home, whether at home or in the world. He was pretty comfortable with himself, with his identity, about who he was. So just because I said that we were defined in some kind of opposition to the Westerners, the Europeans who came to our part of the world, who defined us as the East. They were the West and we were the East. So, but this definition of East is a little problematic because none of us who lived in the so-called East had a common idea of our geography. The East actually is quite vast, the way the Europeans defined it. It starts from what is currently the Muslim world in the Middle East, all the way up to Japan, and India in between. In India, we used to think of ourselves as the country of the South. And the Muslim world, they also thought of them as the center. And so did China. And Japan was probably the only one which thought that they were the East. So the Europeans, when they came, they integrated all of us as the East and made us think, made people like Tagore and people of his generations think as to what was it that defined all of us together as people of the East. But whatever it is, I think it was clear at that time in the 18th and 19th century Asia that you could either passively or dormantly follow the West or try to become like them. India was probably in the first category until the time our own national consciousness and our freedom struggle started. And Japan was on the other side, which started embracing the Western models after the Meiji Restoration, trying to become like an European power. So in the middle of this, it is not very easy for someone coming from Bengal to suddenly feel very confident about his own identity. And that is where Tagore's family background comes into play. He was from a very influential family, which had also worked with the British, was a very affluent family, and had cultural influences from all prevailing the religious influences at that time, the Hindus, Muslims, and the Christians. So his father was in fact one of the top leading luminaries of Brahma Samaj, which is a society formed to reform the Hindu religion, to fight against the orthodoxies of the Hindu religion. And so from childhood, Tagore saw this attachment to religious philosophizing thinking in his family. But he was not a parochial, his family was not a parochially religious oriented family. So his grandfather had traveled widely abroad. They were from the Brahmin, if you know the Indian caste system, which was very prevalent at that time, I would say. His family was from a Brahmin, which is the top class, the thinking class. Normally the Brahmins are not supposed to go out of India, not supposed to cross the sea, because then they become impure. But Rabindranath's grandfather, he traveled extensively abroad. His father did not travel much, but again, as I said, his father was more into the Indian religious revivalism movement. And he himself grew up to be a globetrotter in those days. When travel was not so easy, he had covered every corner of Europe. He had traveled several times to the US, to Latin America, Soviet Russia, Iran, China, Japan, and Southeast Asia. So he traveled extensively in the East and in the West to explore how different countries and different civilizations relate to each other. So all this travel that he did was out of a personal desire to know those countries. He did not have a mini mission. He had a cultural mission for restoring the ancient contacts that India had with each of these countries and to find out new contacts. He did not have any specific educational goal, economic goal, political objectives, or any religious motives. And wherever he went, he made long-lasting friendship with the leading scholars and philosophers of those countries. So he had the great partnership with several people from, say, Romarola in Switzerland, Sylvain Lévy in France, Rothstein in the US, William Butler Yeats in the UK, and Liang Qichao and Xu Zhimo in China, Okakura Kakuzo in Japan. So they were his long-lasting friends with whom he corresponded a lot, and a lot of those correspondences were on the philosophical, the political issues of the time. And he gave lectures wherever he went. He gave extensive lectures, including at the Tsinghua University in, not here, but in Beijing. So in all of this, he reflected a lot on the present day issues, which I will capture briefly under the heading of nationalism, modernity, and the connections, the interconnections between nations. So his views on nationalism. Let's start with Indian nationalism. So when Tagore was living, he experienced two main episodes of nationalist surge in India. The first one was the one that Rajat mentioned a little earlier, when he wrote a lot of patriotic songs to sympathize with the public sentiment which came up after Bengal was partitioned. So then there was a lot of agitation. The intelligentsia of Bengal were consumed by what is called the Swadeshi movement, or in which essentially everything foreign was seen with suspicion and were urged to be boycotted. So this was one phase when he thought that he had to be a nationalist, and he passionately worked for that. The second time was several years later, when Gandhi came in. Gandhi was not there in the previous phase, but Gandhi came in and started his non-cooperation movement, whereby he refused to cooperate with the British in their rule of India. So boycott of schools, colleges, courts. So these were some parts of the tactics and strategy followed by Gandhi to help India achieve independence. Now, Tagore's views on nationalism had evolved dramatically during this period. Just as he was very involved in the first phase, in the second phase, he started questioning the need for nationalism. So he also reflected on this in some of his fictional works, whereby he appealed to the higher sense of humanity rather than the idea of nationalism, which for him should be subservient to humanity. And what did he want to replace it with? He wanted to replace it with the rebirth of a spiritual civilization. So he felt that the idea of nation, he called it the cult of nation. He felt it was a danger to the humanity, and he saw nationalism as leading to a lot of sectarianism and a lot of xenophobia. So he felt that this was against his idea of India and his idea of humanity, because he felt that everybody should be integrated together and we should find a way to live together, which, if we are pushing the idea of nationalism, it will not be possible to do. So this was, of course, a matter of debate, and there is a whole lot written about Tagore's debate with Gandhi, who was, of course, a nationalist, but had his own idea of how nationalism should be developed. Then let me come to Tagore's views on the West, on modernity, and how we should learn from the West in our quest to become modern societies. So Tagore and the West had a very, very unique relationship with the West. Tagore actually as a student had spent some time in the public schools in the UK. And he had deep understanding of the Western civilization. He admired the spiritual contribution of the West. He particularly appreciated the idea of law, the spirit of justice, individual liberty, literature, science, and music that the West has contributed. For him, those were things to be cherished. He acknowledged the greatness of the modern European civilization in its contribution to knowledge, in alleviating human misery, harnessing the forces of nature, and so forth. This he called as the deeper nature of Europe. And he felt that this deeper nature of Europe was based on the spiritual strength of Christianity. But for him, Christianity also reflected the ethos of the East, because Christ was himself an Easterner. But of course, while he admired the Western civilization, he also felt that what we saw in India, our first direct touch of the Western civilization was with the British administrators, and that he felt was not the ideal West that reflected the best virtues of the Western civilization. So that he attributed to the role of nationalism, the role of politics, and the role of war. So these he thought all of these as products of Western materialism without any roots in the world, roots in the East. So for him, modernity was something worth aspiring for, but what kind of modernity would it be? So Tagore and the other contemporaries of his in Bengal and in rest of India had tried to answer these questions by stressing the modernized traditions of Indian religious and philosophical thoughts. I said a little before that Tagore's family itself was at the center of the revivalism movement of Hinduism. So Tagore had a reason to believe that this type of religious revivalism, by discarding some orthodoxies of the past and adapting the religion to the future, could hold a key to a modern India. So this, he wanted India, and later on he also wanted the rest of the world to focus on culture, spirituality, religion, and leave the aspects of political, economic, and military pursuit of power to the West. So some sort of a division of labor is what he had in mind. He felt that we should not be looking to replicate what the West was doing and what he felt the West was good at doing, but we should be trying to do what we have been better at doing. He thought that we were by nature better at pursuing the spiritual, pursuing the philosophical, pursuing the more meditative aspects of culture. Tagore had no use for all the material comforts of civilization. He called them cold-blooded utilitarianism. He disliked machines. Of course, I know that many of you are working with machines, so do we. But he felt that machines were defining men in his generation and enslaving the individuals. So here he believed that the rural life was superior to the urban life. He felt that it was more natural, more harmonious, and less conflict-ridden. So later on, when he was in Tsinghua University, when he was in China, at that time, Hu Shi, who went on to become the president of Academia Sinica and was also a admirer of Tagore, he asked him if Tagore really condemned the large cities and asked people to return to nature. So Tagore had replied to him that the ideal city, in his definition, the ideal city is not about buildings, not about cars and roads, but it should be something that acts as a center of culture, which radiates its influence out to the countryside. So he described, in fact, Rajat has mentioned about the baul music, baul songs. So these are the people who actually go from house to house singing songs. So they take the music, they take part of culture to the houses, to the families. So it is not like, he contrasted, he in fact referred to baul while answering to Hu Shi and said that look at us in Bengal, this part of the cultural heritage is still very much a part of our daily life. We do not think it as something artificial. Singing baul songs and going from house to house singing those songs is part of life for us. But if you look at England, for instance, the plays of Shakespeare have to be staged in a auditorium, and then you have to invite people by selling tickets, etc. So this is the contrast that he made. So for him, the later, what the UK was doing for attracting audience to Shakespeare's plays was a result of Western materialist culture, whereas what the baul singers in Bengal were doing was something, a part of their spiritual heritage. So this is what his idea of the West was, and the idea of modernity was. Tagore believed that the basis of civilization has to be society and the spiritual ideal of man. And he believed that such a civilization in his time was still alive in the East, particularly in China and in India. And he held that Asia had evolved its own civilization, which was not political but social, not mechanical but spiritual. So this, he felt, the spiritual civilization can do no harm. It cannot kill people. But he felt that the material objects that the Western civilization was producing could do good, but also at the same time, as the wars had shown in his lifetime, do a lot of damage. So he felt that the political, mechanical, and commercial character of the modern civilization was trying to take over the traditional society and the philosophy of the East. And when he spoke to people of his generation from Europe and from many places in the West, he became somewhat convinced that after the destruction of the First World War, many of them were also looking for guidance from the East about how Europe and how the West should address this spiritual lack, the spiritual the gaps that they were at that time experiencing. So this made Tagore think about working hard to promote more of what he felt was the idea of the East and take it to the rest of the world. So this gave rise to his other main pursuit, which I will call Pan-Asianism. So this was another of his thoughts that he had developed extensively. The idea that Asia can be a savior of the world, and that only a regenerated Asia can salvage the world, made him work hard, made him travel extensively to the East to explore this idea, to see how this idea was acceptable to the rest of Asia, to the rest of the Eastern world, and to find recruits to this cause among the intellectuals and among the leading scholars of his time. So when Tagore was thinking on these lines, similar thoughts were also being harbored by another great intellectuals of that time, Liang Qichao. So he was also harboring similar ideas. He had been sent to Europe to take part in the Versailles conference after the First World War, and he came back with this experience that many Europeans were asking him, how could Chinese civilization guide us out of this morass? So he was also looking at he was also looking at this whole issue in lenses very similar to Tagore. So both of them wished to create their own synthesis of their culture. Indian culture in case of Tagore, the Chinese culture in case of Liang Qichao. And both of them then wanted to bring about a global synthesis of cultures using their culture as the base. Tagore got to know Liang Qichao a little later. He was not one of the first acquaintances in the East that he had, but Tagore started interacting with the Japanese art scholar Okakura in the early 1900s. And Okakura was one who wrote a very influential book, and he spent a lot of time in India, met Tagore at that time. And he had spoken about three mighty Asian civilizations. In his case, of course, he put Japan at the top because Japan was the most advanced Asian country at that time, but also because Japan was able to assimilate from the Indian civilization and the Chinese civilization very well. Started doing that in the 7th century, and then it went on for a very long time, and then Japan had still maintained its own unique distinction. So Okakura put in his own hierarchical order Japan at the top, and then China and India. But more importantly for Tagore, he spoke about something called an Asiatic mind, a mind of Asia through which Asia thinks, how Asia looks at issues. So when Tagore came across this idea of Okakura, he felt that he needed to explore this more to find out what was an Asiatic mind. So he traveled to the world, to Asia to find about that. But as his starting point of his Pan-Asianism was India and India's long civilizational influence on the world. When Tagore was looking at all these issues, there was a big movement going on by Europeans, not by Asians. By Europeans to understand how Asians interacted with each other throughout the ages. And there was a good scholarship, particularly in France and in the Nordic countries, who wanted to understand the Buddhist connections between India and China. You may know that in India, we don't have a very good tradition of recording things in books. Ours is mostly an oral tradition. Many of the Buddhist texts which had been written in India disappeared because of natural reasons, because of war, and because of not having a culture of preserving documents. So many of those Buddhist texts were available in Chinese because they were translated into Chinese language by the monks many hundreds of years ago. So when India needed those texts, we had to rely on the Chinese text and then retranslate it back to Sanskrit. So this work was being done by people in France, many of them who knew both languages. So they claimed that India, they proved that India throughout the ages had been the home of Eastern humanism. India was the one which influenced China, it influenced Japan. So the Europeans placed India at the center of that cultural universe. And this is what Tagore adopted. Being an Indian, of course, this is his way of showing his nationalism, that India as the fountainhead of spiritual knowledge and ideas of the East. So when he went to Japan and went to China, this is what he wanted to verify for himself, whether his ideas were still acceptable. This idea of spiritual civilization was still alive in these countries or not. So in Japan, Tagore visited several times. I think 4 times he visited, and he came back greatly disappointed. He was disappointed at the pace of modernization that he saw in Japan. He felt that the material needs were overwhelming the finer sensibilities of humankind in Japan. He was particularly outraged when he got to know about the Korean, about Japanese treatment of the Koreans in their colony. And then he minced no words. He was no diplomat. He did not have to worry about what he thought. So he berated those people in public, all his Japanese friends, about what they did by adopting nationalism, politics, and war. So likewise, his lectures were not well received in Japan. Pan-Asianism was not something that the Japanese, at that time particularly, were clearly working for. Japan had adopted a lot of Indian concepts in the past, but at that time, particularly after Japan's victory in the war over Russia, they had become more confident, and they were also an ally of the British who were ruling India. So Tagore, to him, to most of the Japanese, looked like, I mean, either they could feel disdain for him, or they expected from him some reconfirmation of their belief that Japan was the right power to displace the British and take over India and lead India to a brighter future. So occasionally the young Japanese ultra-nationalists came to him, to Tagore, asking them for practical steps to unite India against the West. But because their thinking was again driven by nationalism, it had no appeal for Tagore. So he publicly denounced them, and he kept on upholding a non-political and a spiritual concept of Eastern civilization to Japan. Of course, thereafter, Japan's turn towards militarism only deepened, and it was a tragic story. But at that time, Tagore, he felt highly betrayed by what he saw in Japan. So his story in China was not very different. He had great hopes from China and the collaboration between India and China in leading to a new spiritual civilization in the East because of the past historical glory. And he hoped that if India and China could accept this idea together, it will also bring all the other countries and their neighbors from all over Asia. So his ultimate ideal was not to have one common confederation of countries, but to have a more pluralistic world which was not bound by any political or economic ties, but by the mutual recognition of the diverse expressions of human spirit. So that is what he expected. But at that time, China was going through its most active period of intellectual ferment. This is the time when, after the May 4th movement in China, they were exploring various different ideas from outside, all kinds of new ideas, political, social, philosophical thoughts. Particularly two young men had very different ideas, and we could say that they defined the course of Chinese nation for many succeeding decades. Two people, Chen Tu-Xiu, who went on to become the General Secretary of the Communist Party. He was the founding leader of the Communist Party. And Hu Shi, who became the scholar, who remained a scholar. And of course, he came to Taiwan and died here. So Chen called for a sweeping attack on Chinese tradition. He had no love for Chinese tradition. He thought that it was all retrograde. So the sooner we get rid of this, the better. Hu Shi had a different idea. He was more of a gradualist and more pragmatist. He wanted to retain those Chinese traditions and to assimilate the best modern traditions in such a manner to make it congenial, congruous, and continuous with the civilization of their own making. So they had very different response to Tagore. The other great thinker of China at that time, Liang Qichao, he was genuinely pleased that Tagore had come to China. He gave Tagore a Chinese name, Chu Chentan, which was a double play on his name. Chentan, you can also call it his name, Rabindra, can be translated as Chentan. And Chu is the ancient Chinese name for India, Tianchu. So that was probably Rabindra from India is one way of interpreting that name. The other interpretation would be because the Buddhist text in ancient Buddhist texts refer to China as Chentan. So this could be also that China Tagore. So he gave him a very interesting name. He was genuinely fond of Tagore, but he had no, he spoke extensively about Tagore's work when Tagore had visited, but he also did not mention anything about an Eastern civilization. Obviously, there was no interest, generally speaking, in China in creating some sort of a spiritual civilization. I think Tagore would be probably one among the lone, one of the very few philosophers of the East who was actively looking and working for some kind of a spiritual civilization. Nobody else, not the Chinese intellectuals, not the Japanese intellectuals from whom he had great faith, had accepted this idea. There were a few people in the West who thought that the idea of a spiritual civilization is possible. And in Europe, again, there would have been some instances of this sort of different brand of nationalism. Even when nationalism in Europe also evolved in many different stages. Initially, nationalism was a very good concept. It was associated more with liberty, democracy, those ideas. The French Revolution started this concept of nationhood. But later on, it became more conservative. It became more associated with the military. So this is what Tagore was opposing. But in parallel, there was also a different trend going on in Europe, some parts of Europe, which believed that spiritualism, thinking, mysticism could be a way to unite a nation, not necessarily the political boundaries, the geographic boundaries, etc. So, for instance, there was no country called Poland after the 18th century. It was all broken up and absorbed in different countries and empires. But still, Poland survived through its cultures. The songs that the Polish people sang, the traditions that they maintained. So that kept the idea of a Polish nationality alive. So the Romanticism is another idea of an embodiment of nationalism, which again leads to the same idea, that you don't have to have a political idea of nationality, but it could be a cultural idea. But this obviously did not have any taker in Asia in Tagore's life, and has not since then been taken up in any serious way by anyone. So probably Tagore was the last of the great philosophers in the East who believed genuinely in a spiritual civilization that could come out of the East, and he worked for it. So this is something he did because he hoped not only to establish the supremacy of Asia and the Asian civilization, but he wanted to have a synthesis of the East and the West. So the idea of Vishwabharati, the university that Tagore set up, was his idea of creating that synthesis. He established this university after he had the idea of establishing such a university which will have the best from both East and the West, came to him during one of his travels to the US. And there he decided that he had to have established such a university which will act against what he called the petty ideas of nationalism. So he said that let the first step towards universal union of humanity occur in the fields of Bolpur in Bengal. So I want to make that place beyond the limits of nation and geography. The first flag of victorious universal humanism will be planted there. So this is his words. So Vishwabharati survives today. It is still doing very good work, trying to explore Tagore's philosophy and spread his words about how Tagore looked at this world. Of course, today we live in a very different world. The world order has changed, and many of the ideas that Tagore looked at, explored, are probably not so relevant in our time, or at least we are not directly perceiving them in day in, day out. But in Tagore's time, these were major points of discussion, and how you wanted to define your nationhood, how you want to define your civilization. These were as much a matter of, it was a matter of national outlook, national philosophy. So Tagore obviously did not succeed in any of this in terms of actually implementing, but in terms of ideas, Tagore's ideas still remain very, very powerful. And I think younger generations like today would still do well to once in a while review those ideas to see how the world has evolved since then. But this is not the final world, the final shape of the world that we are seeing today. It will evolve further. So someday maybe this idea of spiritual civilization, the idea of cultural distinctiveness, the idea of pan-Asianism or pan-humanity, the universal humanity that Tagore talked about, will again gain some currency. So with those words, let me once again thank the Tsinghua University here for giving me this opportunity. And I look forward to some questions if there is any. And as Professor Wang said, I'm happy to take them in Chinese.
Ambassador, for excellent speech here. Now I know why 9 out of 1 million can be a diplomat for India.
好，那我想就是我们这一学期的通识人物系列演讲活动呢，就到今天这场就结束。那么希望各位师长还有各位同学可以再参加我们下个学期的通识人物系列演讲活动。那么今天也非常高兴大家能够来来参加我们最后一场。那同时也希望各位都已经拿到我们所准备的印度的小点心，好，然后可能现场没有办法吃，那可以带回去享用。那我们今天真的是非常感谢大使来我们清华。那最后呢，我们是不是再以最热烈的掌声来谢谢大使？